Welcome. Oh, kids. Oh, kids. You've been waiting for this one. We know you have. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. This is going to be, there's going to be some heads exploding with this conversation that we're going to have today, because this is something that we have been trying to get done for a very, very long time. And it's very, very nice to finally have it happen. I'm not going to do too much in the way of introductions because by and large, well, I'm going to make the two people that we have on today do their own introductions, but by and large, I think everybody knows who these folks are for the most part. So let's get right to it. Very excited to welcome back to the show. That's right. Second appearance. Should probably get like a medal or something. NDP MLA, Rakhi Pancholi. And joined the first appearance of the dynamic duo. I feel like there should be capes. Very excited to welcome for the first time to the program, NDP MLA, Janis Irwin. Thank you both so much for taking the time to stop by today.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Sorry it took so long, but I'm here.
Well, it's not like there's a lot of downtime in Alberta politics, so it's understandable. You both have very, very busy schedules. I'm going to start with Rakhi, because I want you've already been on the show, so you've done the introduction, so you've got practice. So I feel like you can like set the level for Janis. Rakhi, if you don't mind introducing yourself to our audience.
Thank you, Nate. I do feel like I should get like on SNL when people have hosted 5 times, they get like a special. So I realize this is only number 2. So I need a few more times before I get that special like 5-timer or like robe. But I'm Rakhi Pancholi. I am the MLA for Edmonton Whitemud. Very proud to serve this constituency since 2019. So it's my second term. I am currently the deputy leader of the Alberta NDP. And of course, Nate, the last time I was on your show was when I was running for leader back in the early months of this year, but super excited to be back again. I'm an Edmonton girl pretty much through and through, raising my 2 kids here. My husband's an assistant principal at a high school here. I've got a rescue dog named Duke, and I really, really love this province, and I love my city.
There we go. So there you go, Janice. That's how it's done. So
no pressure.
I mean, that's the abbreviated version because it's not Rocky's first time on the show. I have a couple of things.
You want my extended bio?
Yeah.
Okay, how much time do we have? I'm just kidding.
She is a Virgo, I believe.
That's true. I'm a Virgo. I like long walks on the beach. Is this also a dating? No, anyways. Okay, focus, Janice. So yes, like Rakhi, I was elected in 2019, and I currently serve as the Shadow Minister for Housing, and prior to that, I was the critic for status of women and 2S LGBTQ+ issues. Let's see, what else about me? I love living in one of the neighborhoods that I represent in central North Edmonton Highlands, Norwood. Beautiful place. If you haven't been, Nate, would love to take you on a tour. And I'm also raising 2 kids, Basil and Oregano. And let me tell you, it's not easy.
No,
not easy.
Until they become teenagers.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, I've just been really honored to be in this role for the last 5 years. And looking forward to our conversation today.
Perfect. I will say we do somewhere have our political correspondent for the UCP leadership race, Oregano. Oregano has run off, and we don't know where Oregano went. But
okay.
Next time you're on, we'll have Oregano make an appearance. But I want to just step back a bit for a sec, because you did a very good job of your bio from 2019 forward. But there's some pieces that I want to talk about today, that your previous credentials and maybe ongoing credentials. I don't know if you're still pursuing the PUD. But talk a little bit about what you did before you got into the politics realm, because there are some pieces around curriculum and education that I'm hoping we're going to be able to touch on today.
Wow, you did some research. Appreciate that. Yeah. So no, I do talk a little bit about being a PhD dropout, but let me back up a little bit. So yeah, I was a teacher in rural Alberta, and so when I got my B.Ed from the U of A, I took a job. I finished my degree a bit early, and I thought I want to just get out there and teach. Lots of my cohorts, they just wanted to stay in Edmonton, and they were going to sub whatever. I saw a job come up in Balf, Alberta. Rakhi knows because she's heard me talk about Balf, Alberta so many times, teaching exactly what I wanted to teach, high school social studies and English. So said, you know what? I'm going to go. So moved out to Camrose and then I would commute to Balf and taught exactly what I wanted to teach for a few years. And the next position took me to Forestburg, Alberta, where I was a vice principal. I was only there for a year when I started to kind of realize, Nate, that I think I needed a bit of a change and I needed to get back to the big city and maybe have some different experiences. So I took on a secondment with the government of Alberta, and the plan was that I would work for 3 years on curriculum with the Alberta government and then come back to my rural school division. Well, plans didn't quite work out as originally thought. And so what happened is a permanent position came up with the government. And so I started working for Alberta Education permanently and yeah, and stayed in Edmonton. And it was by being back in Edmonton, having not grown up here. I was here for my undergrad, but I didn't get out in community very much. I kind of stayed on campus. I'm from a small town, Barrhead. So I really, when I came back to Edmonton for the second time, I really didn't know a lot of people. And one of the things I did is I started volunteering, and I started volunteering with the NDP. And one thing kind of led to the other. I was door knocking all the time. I was helping out candidates, and I saw an opportunity to run federally in what would be a new riding at the time called Edmonton Griesbach. And as I was doing that, I was working full time for the government. I was doing my PhD. I was teaching at the university, and then I decided I was going to run for office. So for some reason, I couldn't do all of those things. There just weren't enough hours in the day.
Something had to go.
Something had to go. And what had to go was the PhD. And so I was, until about 2014, I was working on my PhD in curriculum. And like I said, I was also going pretty hard on the federal campaign. I launched that campaign early. If you'll recall, the federal election was in October of 2015. And I launched my campaign in November of 2013. So almost 2 years in advance. And I wanted to give it my all. And I did. But folks who follow politics will know it was a long fight. That was the second longest federal election in Canadian history, in fact, that one in 2015. And I was unsuccessful in the end. But stayed involved in politics. And eventually when Brian Mason decided he wasn't going to run again in Highlands Norwood, which is where I was living, in the same area that I ran in for Griesbach, I decided to give it another go. And here we are.
Here we are. The rest is history.
The rest is history.
Perfect. So much to unpack there. I feel like we could just spend the entire episode saying Balf over and over again.
Yes, please.
Trust me, do a search in Hansard for the amount of times
true.
that Janis has mentioned Balf in the legislature. You'll see it's very frequent.
Yeah, but maybe don't, because there's been times where, there were some times where we really had to filibuster a lot. And I remember talking about a farmer I dated out in Balf. Anyways, that's for another
episode.
The breakdown after hours, maybe. Yeah.
After dark. Okay, so a couple other things I just wanted, because there's one other thing I wanted to double check, because I have it in my head. That doesn't always mean that it's necessarily reliable. Did you or did you not also win a lottery?
Oh gosh, you got all the dirt. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Like normally people would be really excited to win the lottery, but it was a little bit. Anyways, I won't be dramatic, but yes. So what happened is I had I bought a lottery ticket, and my memory is not that great these days, but in about sometime in March of 2019, I bought a lottery ticket. And that was you'll recall the election date was April 16th, 2019. Yeah. And so for my first time running provincially, and I'd already lost once federally, and I didn't, even though Highlands Norwood was known to be, a very strong NDP seat, I just, I gave it my all. I knocked on every door in that riding, many doors, multiple times. So it was a very chaotic time for me, is the point in all of this. So April 17th, I believe, April 17th, 2019, I'm gassing up at Petro-Canada on 97th and 118th. Locals will know, cheap gas there. And I was just going through my car and I found this lottery ticket. And I thought, oh, I don't even remember buying it. So I stroll into the Petro-Can and what comes up on the little screen? $100,000 winner. And like I'm not a big lottery ticket buyer, but I think the most I'd ever seen was like $10 or something. And I'm like, that can't be right. So I go up to the ladies at the front. I'm like, can you check this for me? And they're like, yeah. Oh no, actually the one lady, I'm still recalling this. The one lady was like, $1 million. And I'm like, no, I don't think it's $1 million. But anyways, it was $100,000. And right away, I think I called my mom and my sister. I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And they were like, well, don't tell anybody because that's going to be annoying because I've just been elected and whatever. So I didn't tell anybody. But what happened is there was a guy in the Petro-Canada who called Stacey Brotzlow, who I think was with CTV or something at the time. And she texts me and is like, Janis, did you win the lottery? And I was like, how do you know? Anyways, so very, very funny how it all went down. But no, it was super lucky and it was lovely. And it helped to pay for some of my mortgage and got to give some money to my niece and nephew. And yeah, so I did. That was a very long answer to that question, but
no, I just wanted to make sure that it was correct in my head because there's these little tidbits that float around in there, and just like to make sure it's true. Got a bunch of different topics that I want to try to cover with both of you in the limited time that we have today. I'm going to start with the easiest and the obvious one because we just finished talking about your CV, Janis. You did curriculum development. So to be clear, you were a bureaucrat, if I'm using the term correctly, with the government during the time of the curriculum development in the roll up to 2019. That curriculum has been the source of a lot of controversy because Jason Kenney did a very, very good job of polarizing it as the NDP curriculum, never minding that it was started under the PCs and was in the works for almost a decade.
Exactly.
I mean, you were a social studies teacher. What was your initial reaction when you saw the first iteration of the UCP's new curriculum?
Yeah, and I mean, oh gosh, I could talk about this for hours too. And in fact, we were both working at Alberta Education in different areas, but we didn't know at the time.
Yeah.
Similar, there was some overlap there. So that's kind of interesting too, that we both came from that. Well, I mean, you were in legal as a lawyer, but we were kind of working on similar things, just not together. But yeah, and I mean, I can tell you, Nate, like I saw the work. So I started out in social studies. My last position before I had to step away was I was the executive director of high school curriculum. So pretty intense role. We hadn't gotten to high school curriculum development yet. So mine was kind of just we were in the fairly early stages. So I can't really speak to that piece, but just, I saw the work that was happening, particularly in social studies, which as you alluded to is kind of one of the most polarized by folks like Jason Kenney. But I can tell you, I mean, we are talking about some of the most brilliant minds coming together to work on that curriculum. We truly had, we had curriculum experts. I know you've talked to Dr. Carla Peck and others before. Curriculum experts, parents, students, teachers from around the province, various stakeholders, various nonprofit organizations. I mean, it was such a robust process. And then we had folks who actually have expertise in curriculum development, right? Which you need to have at the table. And so, I would stand behind the previous curriculum drafts, till the cows come home, for lack of a better phrase, being a barhead girl. I really would. And so when we saw those original documents, and I'm talking like, the ones that Jason Kenney first came out with, where I think it was references to Genghis Khan. And again, you're testing my memory a little bit here because I'm not searching anything. At Genghis Khan in like grade 2 or something like that.
And just crazy
stuff. Yeah. Right. And just so, from a developmental appropriateness level, just so wrong. Right. And any expert in curriculum development would tell you, like, this is not the way. And I mean, you talk about things like scaffolding and you talk about things like progression of concepts. We were taking a very much a concept-based curriculum approach where, there's ways to theme concepts throughout the grades and whatnot. And so, again, very, very sound approach. And so when we saw those first drafts, it was just like, you've thrown all the advice of experts out the window. Not only that, literally, I would say millions of dollars that went into the crafting of those documents, right? Just for, his own ideological purposes.
I can't help but think now that we're sitting here 5 years later, to think about how that was the early harbinger of so much to come, right? When we think about the politicization, the culture war mentality to things, the rebuke of process and expertise, and it's so like I'm humbled as I'm sitting here listening to this because of course I remember all of that, and I remember looking at that first curriculum that the UCP brought in, and I was looking at it as a parent because at the time that new version of the curriculum came out under the UCP, I had a kid going into kindergarten and a kid in grade 2, and I was trying to imagine what they'd be learning, and now I realize, my goodness, that was just the beginning, right? Of so much that has happened, not only in education and healthcare, and so many pieces where misinformation, a rejection of expertise, of taking pieces of things out of context and skewing them, and generating hate and fear and anger around things. That's some of the first examples as elected officials that we dealt with in 2019. And it was really just the beginning of things to come.
That's right, because I'm recalling crashing Adriana Lagrange's press conference. It was happening actually in my area at a Catholic school in a neighborhood that I represent, and I stopped by to hear basically it was their plan to scrap all of our drafts. And at that point, I was already able to say, like, to throw out all this hard work is just, Albertans should be outraged. And, they did speak out quite a lot.
They were, yeah.
I guess the $50,000 question, or maybe I should say $100,000 question, is can either of you find gravity on a globe, though?
Ooh.
I don't know. There's some experts who might say that it doesn't exist. Who knows, right? And they'll teach my kid that gravity exists on a globe. Where is it? And the center of gravity. Oh my gosh, I love that.
Yeah, no. And I'm reminded, Nate, too, actually, and I meant to come back to this, but that was 2019, but fast forward to today. And in fact, just last week in the legislature, I believe it was Nicolaides said something along the lines of he was referring to the indoctrination and social studies curriculum. And I'll have to find it and answer it because I'm just going off my terrible memory.
I remember
the piece around this is the NDP is the government that wanted agents of change in the social studies curriculum. I will find it because I remember responding to Matt Wolf about this. But agents of change, or students being active citizens, has been a part of Alberta curriculum for many, many decades. I think as far back as the 40s or 50s. I'll find that for you because I don't want to make up a number, but it's just like, no, I mean, I worked under consecutive progressive conservative ministers, and we never saw anything to this degree of ideological interference.
Yeah.
Well, this was the next question that I wanted to ask because, we've seen a lot of news coverage in the last couple of weeks, especially in the last week, about Nicolaides reaching into the curriculum to make sure that Albertan students are taught that Alberta's oil and gas industry is the most ethical in the entire world. And I'm just curious, did either of you, either from the legal side for you, Rakhi, or from the content pedagogical side, did either of you see ministers reaching into that previous iteration of the curriculum and saying, okay, I really like what you have here, but this is what I need you to say?
So from my side, when I worked with Alberta Education, I worked in the legal services, right? And actually, I never actually worked for Alberta Education or the government of Alberta when the NDP were in power. All of my time actually predated that. I worked for 5 different PC education ministers at the time, including my predecessor here in Edmonton Whitemud, Dave Hancock, when he was the Minister of Education. And we rarely got involved from the legal side in curriculum, but that's largely because curriculum, first of all, was never seen as a legal issue. It was seen as something that, there was just a process that was like well established. And I'm not going to say there wasn't controversy. I'm sure there was at certain points about what would be in and out of curriculum. I'm sure that's always existed to some degree. But there was at least a respect for the idea of there is a proper way to develop curriculum, and who you want to engage on that are both people who understand the material, but also people who understand how kids learn, right? And their developmental process. And in fact, look, I'll be honest, I saw some political interference in education from ministers of education before. I certainly saw that, not necessarily in curriculum, but I definitely witnessed that. But when I was even the education critic after the 23 election, I was named as the education critic. One of the things that I talked about a lot was that we I didn't want to talk about the curriculum as a politician, because politicians really fundamentally have no business in the curriculum. And I hated the fact that during 19 to 23, I had to think about the fact that, Jason Kenney's grandfather was named in the curriculum, and I didn't want to talk about Mark Kenney. I really didn't want to, because it should not be for politicians to talk about what's in the curriculum. It's for those who understand child development. And of course, we have ambitions about, we want to make sure our kids are equipped with the skills and the expertise, not just to be successful in terms of working and getting jobs, but also successful and active citizens of the world, right? That they understand the world in which they're in. That's what I want for my kids.
Not a radical concept.
It's not a radical concept. So, look, I definitely saw political interference in my time when I was, working for various ministers of education, but I never in curriculum. It's not something we weighed in on, because really there seemed to be a respect for the idea of curriculum lasts for a really long time. And I know that because, my kids have been learning from curriculum that I learned from, right? And so we always believed in the idea that curriculum needed to be updated and reviewed. That's why all governments have engaged in a review process. But you want to make sure that whatever you develop has the staying power, has the relevance, has the significance to be part of what kids are going to learn for a long period of time. So if you're inserting ideological viewpoints at a point in time, and by the way, we can look at what's happening in the changes that have been brought forward to the Education Act and the Bill of Rights, for example, in this most recent session. And what you're going to see is that these documents, these legislation, these guiding principles no longer have a forward-looking approach. They're actually frozen in a very period of time. And the period of time in particular that we're seeing from this government right now is being frozen in this COVID war that they're still having in their heads and within their membership. And now it's all of a sudden in our Bill of Rights, and all of a sudden in-person learning is a priority in terms of education, because they're relitigating the grievances from COVID. So we're freezing things, they're freezing things in time, and they're not going to have the staying power that important things like education should have.
What do you got to add to that, Janis?
Yeah, I mean, not a lot, but we saw it so much with Kenney. We've seen a little bit with Smith, but I just recall Kenney many times talking about the insertion of ideology in curriculum under the NDP, which again, it wasn't under the NDP. The social studies curriculum were developed, because I was there for many of the pieces that were developed under consecutive PC ministers of education. But he would talk a lot about this insertion of ideological buzzwords like reconciliation and climate change and gender, and it's like these are topics that are common in Western curricula. And I mean, we absolutely should be talking about climate change. We absolutely should be talking about reconciliation, right? And for them to point at these as ideological buzzwords, it's appalling. Absolutely.
Yeah, we saw
Janis for saying the plural properly there. She just said curricula instead of curriculum. Shout out to Janis.
Well, yeah, I mean.
But it's the reconciliation piece is an important one, because as we've seen, we just had a conversation with Dr. Peck a couple episodes ago where she highlighted the fact that there is still no references to truth and reconciliation. There's no references in the current curriculum that's being rolled out to residential schools. And as much as that is unquestionably to understate it, an uncomfortable part of Canadian history, if not straight out horrifying, to not learn from the mistakes of history and to not allow kids the access to the lessons of history really kind of hobbles them. So it's fascinating that they've chosen not to include these things.
It's incredibly alarming. Again, I can point to social studies where, we would, especially in social studies 10, the grade 10 level, I mean, students would have learned a little bit about residential schools prior, and they're learning more now. But, like when I started teaching to be able to tell students, I mean, the last residential school closed in their lifetime, and not so much anymore because we've gotten older, but 1996, right? And I mean, this isn't, yeah, now the students are.
Just pointed at me when
no,
you said they gotten older.
We're both getting older, Rakhi. Anyways, where was I going with that? Yes, we're old. Our memories are failing. But no, I mean, you're right. It's a horrifying part of our history. But, we need to talk about it. As, the late, great Murray Sinclair said, right? Mm-hmm. Education got us into this mess, but education will get us out of it. And I think we all need to be remembering his words.
I want to get into some of the legislative changes, and I want to be clear towards the end, and I'm watching the clock like a hawk today because I know everybody's got hard stops, but I'm going to leave some space because I'd love to hear what the issues are that the two of you believe that the government of Alberta should be focusing on. But we can't really do that without talking about what the government of Alberta is focusing on. And I have a couple of things that in particular, I'd like to get your thoughts on as you're both sitting MLAs in the legislature, and some of this stuff very directly affects you. The first one that I want to talk about is the changes to the Conflict of Interest Act.
Mm.
Um, Obviously, here at the breakdown, we've got a little bit of a bias on that whole subject because we kind of spent the last 6 months wading through it. But we saw Danielle Smith and the UCP introduce some pretty sweeping changes to the Conflict of Interest Act. We've seen the latitude with which they've interpreted it, I'll say, has created some problems. So I'll go with the legal mind first.
Just
What
the legal mind. Let her answer that one.
And you mean
what is
specifically around the gifting issue, right? Is that right, Nate? Yeah.
Well, the gifting and the attending of the hockey games. I mean, I realize that this is an issue that the UCP have done a very good job of trying to downplay, despite the fact that the outgoing ethics commissioner was like, "Yeah, you absolutely cannot do this thing." They went ahead and did it en masse. So, what's your take? Here's how I'll phrase the question. What's your take on the current rules that exist for MLAs? Are they good enough? Should they be tightened up? And secondary to that, how do they compare to other jurisdictions and other corporate environments?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we spoke out pretty strongly against the changes that were coming out when they were introduced in the last spring session. Look, this is so basically for any of your viewers who are kind of watching and wondering. I mean, essentially what they did is they removed the obligation for MLAs to report on gifts, and that they can accept gifts really up without really any parameters around it. And more importantly, they also changed the rules to allow their political staff to accept gifts and not report it, by the way. So this is, even at the time, it's like basically they're allowing themselves to openly be influenced by those who will buy them expensive gifts. And we saw exactly that happen, right? We saw that, of course, in the spring. I know the premier seemed to think that the only important way to show her support for the Edmonton Oilers was to attend fancy box seat tickets, right? Accept those fancy tickets. I don't know. I did a pretty good job supporting the Edmonton Oilers by wearing my jersey and watching the game at home with my kids. That's what a true fan does. But anyways, and of course, those box seats were provided by a gentleman who also was heavily involved in the Turkish Tylenol fiasco, right? It was his company that helped import Turkish Tylenol. This is all trading of favors, right? That's exactly what this is. And she removed those rules to basically say, with that impunity, she wants government officials to be able to be lobbied by those who can provide expensive gifts. It's like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Now, listen, we've seen previous conservative governments go down because of the result of entitlement. I don't know if the political climate has changed. I think it has to some degree, but I will say we're fully aware that Hockeygate scandal certainly didn't go over very well with a number of the premier's base. Now, clearly, she managed to do what she needed to do and give them what they needed to do to forget it and get a very, high endorsement from the 4,200 people who voted for her in her leadership review a couple weeks ago. But ultimately, this is sending a message to Albertans that if you want to influence government, if you want to influence the cabinet and the premier, you got to have money. And that's the way the way they're gonna do their business. Now, other provinces clearly have rules that say that if MLAs elected officials are going to accept gifts over $200 or $250, they have to declare it, they have to get permission. That's a pretty common practice. So now Alberta is in a situation where it's the Wild West when it comes to lobbying from wealthy donors or people who want the businesses done. And that was a deliberate choice. It's not like it was an accidental thing or we just haven't modernized our rules to match up with other provinces. This was a deliberate choice by the premier to roll back those provisions and make it easier for MLAs and elected officials and political staff to accept gifts. It's an entitlement to the worst degree. It shows a level of corruption, and we've seen it pan out. And it's not the practice by which we are going to conduct ourselves. And you'll see that coming out a little bit more from us going forward. But I continue to notify the ethics commissioner if I'm going to be accepting a gift, even though I know I don't have to anymore under the conflict of interest rules. I think it's important. I think it's important to Albertans to know what we're accepting, who's paying for things, and we're going to continue to kind of practice the way we think government should be acting.
Janice?
Yeah, what she said, really. No, honestly, I don't have much to add to it. It's just, and I think just the one piece that I would add is, at a time when we hear from our constituents, from folks all across Alberta who are struggling, right? And it's just, it's so out of touch and insensitive to be just bragging about these lavish gifts when, you should be focused on the needs of the folks you purport to represent.
Yeah, it's wild to me the way that she, but the people want to see me at the hockey games cheering the Oilers on with them from the elite skyboxes that 95% of them will never ever have access to because I'm one of them. It's a fascinating message to send out.
Well, and the only reason that and it's not exactly like she was advertising the fact that she was there because she knew it was something that was like, this is the thing. There's that gut test that you have as a politician. The only reason that we all know that the premier and now 5 of her ministers attended those games was because somebody clandestinely took a photo and it was published. It's not like she was like, here, I'm wearing my Oilers jersey and cheering hard. I mean, and by the way, I don't know, from a lot of seats, you can't see the box seats if you're a regular person. And certainly when you're watching from TV, like most Albertans were, you don't get to see what's going on in the box seats. So she knows that doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't pass. I mean, a lot of her conduct doesn't, but she's a very smooth twister of words. But I don't think she's fooled a lot of people on that one.
The network that picture captured was to me the most telling piece because like literally everybody in those skyboxes has business with everybody else. So the notion that there's no conflict of interest there may not be one by the letter of the new legislation that she rewrote, although that seems to be open to some interpretation as well. The gut check that you talked about, I think that there's, most people would look at that and go, oh, that doesn't seem great. My favorite part about that whole situation, and we haven't talked about this yet, but we got a hold of her calendar for that period of time through a FOIP request. And she literally met with, right before she flew out to Vancouver, she had a meeting. And that meeting was with Alison Redford, and you just can't make this stuff up. But I want to talk about the Freedom of Information stuff because there's been some big changes to the Freedom of Information Act. A lot of the information that we were able to access on all of those things, we were only able to do so because of existing Freedom of Information Act rules. So I'm going to throw this one to Janice first, and then we'll get the legal opinion. No, I'm going to do it. I'm throwing it to you first. This is your first time on the show. I get to ask you questions. What do you make of the changes to the Freedom of Information Act, Janice?
Yeah, I'll start. But listen, Nate, I don't know if you follow the legislature too often, but I'm an intelligent human, but lawyers have a special gift. They really do. And Rakhi, especially when we first couple years, we sat beside each other. And I don't know, some of those bills, you try to read them and there's a lot there. And so I was very lucky to have legal counsel beside me to interpret some of these bills for me. So anyways, that's my point in saying she'll give a better legal answer. But I mean, it's fascinating when we looked at, Jason Kenney was kind of viewed as, was it like the most secretive premier in Canada? I can't remember that study that came out when he was in power. And it's, we thought in so many ways, I mean, we can talk to so many pieces of legislation, we thought things couldn't get worse. And now fast forward to 2024, and it appears that this government is now, Danielle Smith's government is on track to be the most secretive under this new legislation.
Yeah. And what we know too, of course, like the 2 pieces of legislation that were introduced or the bills that were introduced late last week, They basically took the existing FOIP Act, which the FOIP Act had both the protection of privacy piece, but also the access to information piece, and they've split it into two pieces of legislation. So we're still going through it in detail, but what I can say, based on a preliminary look at it, and my understanding of the changes that have come out, is like, first of all, let's be clear, we have a real problem in this province, in particular, around access to information. And one of the things I know I'm trying to get a little bit of background information at some point, like we had the number of requests for access to information that were not even coming close to meeting the timelines that were in the legislation. Like it's through the roof, right? And you've probably experienced that, Nate, as somebody who makes those information requests, and so does the opposition as well, right? So there was a lot of work that needed to be done to modernize this act and to improve it. Of course, changing the legislation is one piece, but like if you don't have the people behind the scenes to process the requests, to like go through the data, like that is a huge piece of this. It's not just what the legislation says, but it's like you actually have to like resource people, and government is like really obviously driven out a lot of their public servants. And so I think that's a huge factor. What we do know is it looks like they've made some changes around timelines, for example. So it used to be that you had to get a response on a FOIP request within 30, it used to just say 30 days in the act. We understand the new piece of legislation says 30 business days. So of course, that's a longer period of time. I think there's going to be changes like around whether or how much assistance a public body has to provide when a request is made. So how much are they helping you? It allows them to kind of rule out some requests if they're, quote, not reasonable, like if they're not a reasonable amount or topic, I believe. I'll have to look at the wording specifically on that one, which means there's a lot of discretion there for government and public bodies to say, you know what, your request isn't reasonable. We're not going to process it. So there's a huge challenge there. And I think the one piece that's like, again, in line with the changes that we just saw around the Conflict of Interest Act is apparently they're going to exempt a lot of records from political staffers. And so when you think about some of the things that you just mentioned, Nate, like some of the pieces around repayment of things, and like that relates to the conduct of political staff. And so if those records are now going to be exempt, meaning you make a request for access to information and you don't get access to that, I think we're going to see a lot more hidden there. And again, I mean, these are very technical pieces of legislation and bills. It's about transparency. And what we've seen is a pattern of behavior from this government where they want to hide more things. They want to be less transparent. They want to allow the rules to be looser so that they can do things without scrutiny, without having to answer for them, whether it be taking gifts, whether it be the information that they're exchanging in emails with their political staff. Like there's more and more of our democratic institutions, which, by the way, access to information is a key part of that, is that it's being undermined at every step, right? So this is the way things are chipped away at, right? And they're going to hope that there's so much other distraction and noise, because that's a lot of what they do as well, so that Albertans don't see and don't recognize it. And frankly, Albertans don't have the energy and time right now to be focused on the ways that Danielle Smith is undermining democracy. They're too worried about being able to pay the bills, to be able to manage their kids in a classroom of 40 kids, which is, by the way, the average class size of the junior high in my riding. 40 kids is the average size. They're worried about can they get a surgery in a timely fashion. They don't have a family doctor. So guess what? They're not going to be able to pay attention to and give their resources to is these technical bills that are going to make it harder for people to know what Danielle Smith's government is doing.
Yeah, I saw that the former leader of the opposition filed a FOIP request looking for the approvals that had been done for gifts over 500 for staffers. There are no records. We FOIP'd that a while back, and there's no records of any approvals at all, which totally tracks with the Skybox tickets.
Totally.
Nothing to see here. Electoral boundaries, and looks like you guys are getting some neighbors in maybe more than one way. Mickey Amer came out and announced that there were going to be 2 new seats added to the legislature, and in absolutely no way attempted to influence the placement of those seats in northern Alberta because of primary reason of geography and a primary reason of population and a primary reason of safety. I love how you can have so many different primary reasons. They just make it easy. What are your thoughts on the electoral boundaries? Because this could be a really, especially for Edmonton, because y'all have the donut. This could be a really effective way of the question came up at the press conferences. Is this all about diluting the progressive vote? And if they start to draw, instead of the boundaries the way they are, as like big chunks of a pie, that's going to change a lot of things about how people vote. So what are your thoughts on the bonus MLAs and the boundaries?
Well, I can start just by saying, I mean, I haven't been fully, deeply engaged in this yet because as you know, we've had a few other bills taking our attention. But I'm an MLA who represents very mature neighborhoods in central Edmonton, and I'm likely to not be affected greatly. But I think about my colleagues. I mean, I have colleagues in South and West Edmonton who have 20, 30,000 more electors than I do, right? Because their communities are just growing so rapidly. Similarly, in North Calgary and in some of those suburban areas, like you said, the donut, that sort of thing. The growth is just substantial, and I am worried, and it's concerning, given everything you just talked about, the ways in which this UCP government is under. You didn't say this, but I'm saying it is undermining democracy. I think I did say. Maybe you did. Maybe you did. Was I listening to everything Rakhi said? Hard to say. But the point being, I mean, this is another. You're gonna edit this, right? No, just kidding. Yeah, exactly.
We'll keep that in.
Yeah,
that's a record.
Fine.
Oh, we will.
Yeah. No, I mean, I really do worry that this is going to be another way in which they can truly undermine democracy. And I feel like, listen, I born and raised in rural Alberta. As I said, I taught in parts of rural Alberta. I want rural Alberta and I want northern Alberta, remote parts of Alberta to be represented, absolutely. But I think you could talk to a lot of Albertans and they would agree with the principles of fairness, right? Yeah. And that's my concern, is that the UCP, and given what Mickey Amory has kind of alluded to, that they're not coming at it from a place of good faith, right?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, they've increased the number of MLAs in the legislation from 87 to 89. And why that might seem good, but let's be honest. I mean, Alberta alone in the last 12 months gained 200,000 new people. Wow. So if you think about it, right now I represent about 50,000 people in my riding. I know my colleague Nathan Ip represents closer to 70,000. So if you're talking about 200,000 just in the last year, leave alone from the previous electoral boundaries review, we need more than 2 seats. There's no doubt about that, right? That just doesn't even come close to reflecting the increase in population that Alberta has seen. And what they've done is they've changed that, the considerations around drawing boundaries being, driven to some degree. It's never been the only decisive factor, but it's been a key factor to consider municipal boundaries, right? So that just makes sense, from a local representation perspective, right? If you're in the city of Edmonton, you are gonna have much more in common with the folks who are also in the city of Edmonton than the folks that are, maybe, tens of, maybe dozens of kilometers away in a more rural type municipality, but it borders yours. This is about local representation. It's about fairness, right? And again, I keep coming back to, this is all about the UCP rejigging the rules to benefit them. Yeah. And something, the leader of our party, Naheed Nenshi, has said a few times, which is 100% true, is that for the UCP, the goal is winning. The goal is always to win, right? It's to change the rules. It's to make it easier. It's to hide information. It's to give them advantages and seats to help them win. That is their sole objective. That's their endpoint. That's their goal. They want to win all the time. Winning is actually just the starting point for a party that actually wants to govern. We want to win because that's the way we get to reach our ultimate objective, which is to govern for all Albertans. So it's not the end point, it's the beginning point. But when your sole objective is to change the rules and to make it easier for you to pull the wool over Albertans' eyes, to bend things, to move things so you can win, that's what we see from a legislative agenda from this government, right? They're not prioritizing the things that Albertans truly care about. They're making it easier for them to win. And frankly, Albertans need somebody who's actually willing to govern, not just win.
I just found it fascinating that his whole press conference was predicated on the idea of, oh, we've got these northern areas, they're so hard to represent. And it's like, are you tacitly admitting that you can't represent northern Alberta? Is that what you're saying here, Mickey?
We're happy to step in.
It's going to be fascinating to see the new riding that includes Chestermere with Edmonton. That's my favorite thing that I'm
Wow. It's
most
gonna be a
excited.
long commute, but
There you go.
I want to talk. We're coming up to the last 12 minutes that I have you here for. So I want to talk about two other big topics. One of them is what would you like to be talking about as opposed to the thing we're going to talk about next? Because we have seen Danielle Smith introduce a suite of policies that go against all available evidence. They quite literally go against the charter to the point where Danielle Smith has mused about invoking the notwithstanding clause, which, again, to be clear, is a mechanism by which provinces can say, yeah, those are really nice charter rights you've got there, but we don't want you to have them for 5 years. So I'm going to get Rocky to go first because I think Janis is going to be the closer on this topic.
all
Uh,
right.
what are your takes on this new suite of regression?
Yeah. So, we saw those bills introduced and we began debating them last week in the legislature. So one of the things that, I made a point of doing, and I know my colleagues did, when we spoke in debate, is to begin by sending a message to trans kids and to trans Albertans and their family members and their friends and their colleagues and the people who love them. Because let's be clear, we all know somebody in our lives who is in the trans community or connected to the trans community. And to make sure that they know that they're loved and supported, and there are people here who care deeply about their safety, their well-being, their success. And that is very much where we need to begin from, is a place of acknowledging that this is causing real harm to a very vulnerable group of people. And it is done intentionally by government. That's the point of it, because it's meant to other these Albertans. It's meant to create a huge distraction at their expense. We know the data is very clear about the high risk that trans kids in particular, and non-binary kids and adults, are at risk of depression and suicidal ideation. We know all that. That is like undisputed. And what we saw, to your point, Nate, was that three pieces of legislation around limiting access to gender affirming healthcare for young people under the age of 18, limiting school as a safe space for those who are trans to be able to choose their pronouns and their names, and also to deny them access to sports and physical activity. And none of that is based in evidence. The health pieces are about, limiting access to care that didn't even actually wasn't even provided. It's limiting access to surgeries that weren't being provided to young people under the age of 18. And then it's limiting access to hormonal treatment and hormone blockers, when those are decisions that are made between a young person and their parent and a medical provider. For a government that claims to be advocating for parents, they are actually substituting their own judgment for parents because of who their children are. And that is just despicable. And of course, they're denying access to particularly girls are going to be singled out, and young women in access to sport. The thing is, they've taken very real, I think, concerns and questions that exist for parents out there who are, there's a lot of deliberate misinformation that has been spread. I will say by, actors of the government as well as of their political party, and people in their community have deliberately spread misinformation about what's being taught in schools, what healthcare is available, and they've used that to stoke up fear and division. And they've created a problem that doesn't exist, and now they claim to be fixing it. And while they are doing this for political gain, there's no doubt about it that this was about the premier trying to get support for her leadership review. This is not just political games that are silly or nonsensical. These have very real impacts on incredibly vulnerable kids. To see the premier, who 10 years ago was leader of the opposition, stood up in the House and cried, talking about how she didn't want to out kids by telling their parents that their child was enrolled in a GSA. She now has absolutely no problem requiring parents to be notified and get their consent before their child can go by a different pronoun. Now, look, I'm a parent myself. I, of course, want to be heavily involved in everything that happens in my kid's life. I want to know what's happening. I want to be able to have a relationship with my kids' teachers and their school to understand. And instead of developing that relationship between parents and their schools, to understand that the things that they're being told that are being taught in schools is not happening, that this is like American stories about, whatever the we've all seen the memes and the stuff that goes around, that it's not true. There is an opportunity to bring parents together with teachers and to help them understand. Parents, by the way, who may have cultural barriers, language barriers, they're struggling to make ends meet, working two jobs. The idea, if you really want to lead and be a government, is bring people together to better understand what's happening and do that because it's best for kids. That is not the path that this government chose. They chose instead to make this a political culture war, and the consequences are going to be felt by the most vulnerable kids. And frankly, it was really difficult to understand how government and their ministers and the premier can sleep at night, knowing what they're doing and that it was purely for political gain.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so heavy, right? I mean, it makes me emotional even to talk about it still. And part of why I didn't stand up in debate last week is because I didn't know if I'd be able to get through it, right? Because it's very, very personal. And I'm not a member of the transgender community, but I have just so many friends and colleagues and friends with kids who are transgender, who are literally heartbroken. And as Rakhi said, I mean, it's not a game anymore. We're talking about real people's lives. And you actually shared the video of me speaking in the House a couple weeks ago before debate began, where I did pull up a number of Danielle Smith's statements in the past, right? And had you said to me, Nate, last year, maybe a year prior, when she became leader, if she would touch this, I would have said no.
Yeah.
I would have said no. Danielle Smith is a libertarian. She will probably do some things we very much disagree with. That's a fact. But she's not going to wade into 2S LGBTQ plus rights. I was wrong. I was fully wrong. And yeah, I just, I think about the real life consequences of this. And I think about the fact, and this maybe is a segue into your final question. I'm not meaning to go there, but I think about the fact that this is a government that is dedicating a quarter of the legislative session to anti-trans legislation. And I can tell you, and I've talked about this a lot in the legislature, I mean, I talk to a lot of people, not just in the NDP bubble of Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood, right? I've knocked on doors all over this province. I was in Banff, Kananaskis not long ago. I've been in other parts of the province door knocking a lot, and I talk to people, and people reach out to me. I can honestly say that this issue does not come up, because what do I do when I'm knocking on doors? I say, what are your top priorities? What can we, what can we be focusing on as your NDP opposition? What do they say? They say healthcare. Healthcare comes up. It's number one for sure. A close second, especially in where I door knock the most, my area, is affordability, housing, right? That whole the whole spectrum of just trying to make ends meet, right? Education comes up as well. Trans rights, attacking trans folks doesn't come up. I'll say sometimes in Highlands Norwood it comes up in the sense of they don't want the government touching trans rights, but it's not top of mind. And so as Rakhi said, we know exactly why Danielle Smith is doing this. And I just can't believe that Danielle Smith of not even just 10 years ago, of 2 years ago, where she talked about, again, her non-binary family member and how we shouldn't be discussing these issues, making them a political football. I cannot believe that we're here in this place with this woman.
So I mean, you stole my last question from me, Janis.
Sorry, Nate.
So I guess I just have to ask Rakhi it now. What are the issues I mean, you're the deputy leader. What are the issues that the NDP, and I have one last quick question, so you have to leave me like 60 seconds at the end. What are the issues that the NDP would like to be bringing forward to address the concerns of Albertans?
Yeah, I think Janis really nailed it. I mean, there is some universal issues in this province that, like, to Janis's point, no matter where you go, you'll hear them. You won't be surprised to hear this. We spent a little bit of time in Lethbridge.
Oh, in Lethbridge, that's where I forgot. Door knocking there, yeah.
There's a little thing happening soon there. You want to talk about, healthcare, talk to people in Lethbridge, right? Like there's no family doctor taking patients in Lethbridge. I would say half of the people I talked to while I was there last, if I asked them about a family doctor, they were traveling somewhere else to go, like they were going to Calgary to see a family doctor, or they didn't have one at all. right? They just were making do. And that's, I mean, Lethbridge is one of the worst in terms of access, but it's happening all over the province. So there's absolutely no doubt that healthcare is a priority. And this is not just, yes, we understand that healthcare is a challenge across the country, but there are things that this government should have prioritized. It's been over a year since they committed to signing a new deal with family doctors. Almost 1 million Albertans do not have a family doctor, and this government has been dragging their heels on signing a new deal with family physicians. It's unthinkable, right? I know Janis and I'm actually not sure if you were there, but a bunch of us met with some med students from U of A and UC who are thinking about family medicine in the spring, and they were saying they're all thinking of going to BC. So that has got to be a priority. Cost of living, oh my goodness, right? Like, again, when we talk about electricity bills, car insurance, we're like paying the highest rates across the country. We are outliers. Again, cost of living is affecting everybody. Grocery prices, there's challenges on what we can address in terms of as a provincial government, but utility rates and car insurance. And then let's be clear, the government talks a lot about how the economic indicators look like Alberta's economy is booming, right? We've got some numbers around, GDP and investment, but that isn't registering for people every day in their lives in Alberta. In their homes, we've seen the lowest wage growth in the country, highest unemployment in the country as well.
Fastest rent increases.
So those things, those are within government control, right? Not full control, but there's influence there. If government was paying attention to those things, making sure that Albertans were actually being able to earn more. And then you look at the thousands of public sector workers, and not just public sector workers, but who are facing collective bargaining right now. EAs make less than poverty wages, but we know that classrooms are more crowded and more complex than ever. And those EAs are doing incredible work for less than poverty. It's unbelievable. So these are things that should be all the focus of government right now. We should be talking about cost of living. We should be talking about healthcare. We should be talking about education, and we should be talking about sustainable growth of our economy. But that, again, you will not see a bill on any of those topics in meaningful ways coming forward from this government right now, because they are not interested in governing. They're interested in winning.
All right, last question, because I know I'm like watching the last 58 seconds of this tick by, and Janis, pretty sure I can see you checking the clock.
No.
Real quick, you got a new boss. Scale of 1 to 10. Where does the Ninshi rate right now?
What is that? 72,000? What? That should be the scale. That's how many people voted for him to be our leader of the party. 72,000, I think it was. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, it's incredibly exciting, right? Like we are only where we are right now because of the incredible work of Rachel. And she really changed the political landscape forever in Alberta. And Nahid's really just leading us into the next stage, right? Which is that opening more people's eyes to what we can be in terms of government, bringing that perspective that we need, right? Like that, it's interesting to see, he doesn't have that history in partisan politics. So we need that, right? We need that perspective, because I truly think that as we move forward, people need to move out of their teams and be less divided. And it's going to take being able to talk to somebody basically on common ground issues rather than on what team you're on. And he really brings that. So it's been really great.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, biggest provincial party in Canada, right? And just the growth in our party, the new members, it's really, really exciting. And and he's really working hard to with all of us to communicate the vision that we will have for Alberta. And hopefully in 3 years, we'll be having this conversation as your government.
There we go. Well, I know you have a hard stop, so I'm going to let you get out of here, Janis. Thank you both so much for taking the time to chat today. I'm so glad that we got both of you.
Next time, oregano and basil and
Duke.
Duke. No, not Duke.
Okay. Duke will eat your cats. Yeah.
Wow. Anyways. Okay. Oh, that escalated quickly.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Nate.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.